Hey everybody, Mr. John here from the Meredith Public Library, back at you once again with another episode of the Quarantine Theater. Today I have installment 2 of If Then and Now, where I take a look at 4 books available in the public domain and 4 contemporary novels along the same themes. So public domain means that it's out of copyright and is owned by all of us, the public. So they're free to read. There's a lot of great places to find public domain books. I recommend Project Gutenberg, that is gutenberg.org. And they've got over 60,000 public domain titles available for you to read or listen to right now. You'll also find a lot of these titles just through your favorite downloadable books app. I use the Libby app by Overdrive, and you're going to be able to find a lot of them there. Libby is also a great way to read the other 4 titles, which, as of this morning, were all available for you to read today. All right, so our first public domain title is Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. Now, this is a classic, and the real reason it is because it kind of invented the pirate genre. Pretty much every pirate trope that we think of today, peg legs, parrot on the shoulder, treasure maps with X marks the spot, these are all invented by Robert Louis Stevenson in Treasure Island. It was originally published in 1883. It was serialized, meaning it was published in pieces in a magazine called Young Folks, which is just a funny name for a magazine. I get a real kick out of that, Young Folks. But you can tell it's kind of got like a middle grade target audience here for Treasure Island. Now, if you want a modern pirate tale for a much older audience, I highly recommend Pirate Latitudes by Michael Crichton. Now, Michael Crichton, hopefully you know, is the author of books like Jurassic Park. He also created the television show ER. So for a while in the early 90s, he had both the top television show and the top movie in the world at the same time. Now, Crichton's calling card was he does the research. Before he was an author, he was a doctor, and his first few books were based on his medical research. He is a scientist at heart, and those come through in all of his books. Pirate Latitude, he especially has done decades of research on. Now, it's an interesting story. So Pirate Latitudes was actually published after Michael Crichton died. Crichton died in 2008. An assistant found this completed manuscript of Pirate Latitudes on one of his computers, and it was published posthumously. So we don't know for sure, but as far back as the 70s, Michael Crichton was talking about his pirate passion project. So there's a good chance that this is the book that he spent decades researching. Based on actual events that happened when a privateer was hired by the governor of Port Royal, which is a place you may recognize if you're a Pirates of the Caribbean fan. The privateer was sent to collect a huge amount of treasure in a Spanish galleon and in a fortress, and there's all kinds of excitement going on. Now, like I said, he's a researcher, and this is going to read very real. Unlike Pirates of the Caribbean, which I just mentioned, Michael Crichton doesn't gloss over the violence, the slavery, the sexuality of the era. They all come through, and he dives headfirst into it. It's a really exciting book. So definitely recommend Treasure Island. That's for a little bit of a younger audience, and you adults are really going to get a kick out of Pirate Latitudes. Really good book. All right, our next public domain book is From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. This is a really interesting tale of an attempt to get astronauts to the moon. Now, of course, this book was written in 1865. So Jules Verne had to invent all of the technology. So what they wind up doing is they basically build a huge cannon and shoot them to the moon. But he does the research, and he designs a cannon that would allow them to break free from our gravity and get into space, but at the same time wouldn't shoot them out at such a velocity that the passengers would be crushed by the force. So he really does the work on the science side of this. In fact, the subtitle of this book is A Direct Route in 97 Hours, 20 Minutes. Which is the math that he did, and he figured out what it would take for his spaceship launched his way to actually get to the moon. You know, I was just curious, so I looked up how long it actually takes to get to the moon, and the Apollo 11 did it in 51 hours and 49 minutes, so a little over half of what Jules Verne's ship thought it would take. So again, he's really doing the work, but you can tell it was written 150 years ago. There are working windows on the spaceship, and at one point they throw something out the window while they're in space, which is just silly now, but it's really interesting to look back on what hard sci-fi thought space travel would be so long ago. Now, if you want a modern look, what hard sci-fi thinks space travel is going to look like in the very near future, I would recommend The Martian by Andy Weir. Now, you may have heard of this one. It was turned into a movie with Matt Damon. The story here is that a group of astronauts in the near future has landed on Mars. However, after only a short time, a storm forces them to leave, and in the hubbub, they think a astronaut dies and they leave him behind. Turns out he does not die and has been abandoned on Mars, where he has to do the science to figure out how to live for several years. So again, this is nerd porn. The main character does math in like every chapter. It's great. There's whole pages of calculations and stuff. But Andy Weir really balances that out with an exciting and entertaining main character. He's kind of foul-mouthed and sarcastic, and he's really fun to read, even when he's really getting into the science. Again, Andy Weir did his best to make all the science here work, and it almost all does. The only unrealistic bit of science, and he will admit this, is unfortunately the impetus for the entire story. There's not enough atmosphere on Mars for there to be a storm. So this wouldn't happen in real life. But Andy Weir said he needed something to cause, to cause the peril that he needed, and that was the only thing he could come up with. So that's the only non-realistic part. Everything else, all the math checks out. It's really entertaining. So it's really fun to read these kind of back to back, and just to get the hard sci-fi view of space travel, 150 years apart. Really entertaining. From the Earth to the Moon and The Martian. All right, our next public domain title is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. This is a book, unlike a lot of the other public domain titles that I've looked at, that modern readers are really going to get a kick out of. This one reads way ahead of its time. So Count of Monte Cristo was originally published in 1844. Again, it was originally serialized, just like Treasure Island. It was released in bits and pieces in a literary magazine. The story here is the classic revenge tale. This is one of the reasons it's so ahead of its time, is that modern audiences, a revenge tale is very common, and we're going to be familiar with it. This was kind of ahead of its time in the 17th century. The story is that a sailor is accused of treason. He's framed and thrown into prison for many years. Now, while in prison, he meets another prisoner who, while dying, informs him of an escape plan and a treasure that he's hidden. So the main character, Edmond Dantes, manages to escape from prison. He finds the treasure and then returns to his home under the guise of the Count of Monte Cristo and exacts his revenge on everyone who wronged him. Again, this is going to read way ahead of its time. It is exciting. This is a book that you are really going to love. If you've never read Count of Monte Cristo, go and do it. It's not going to read like, you're in English class. It's going to read like you're reading an exciting, James Patterson novel off the rack or something. You're going to really enjoy the Count of Monte Cristo. So I was thinking of a modern revenge tale, and then I thought of a movie I just saw the other day. True Grit. The original novel was by Charles Portis. This came out in 1968. Interestingly enough, this was also serialized. This was released in bits and pieces in the Saturday Evening Post. So this tells the story of Maddie, whose father was murdered by a man named Cheney. Cheney had been working on their farm, but he stabs the father in the back, steals hundreds of dollars and several gold coins. Now Maddie is trying to find him, get revenge. So she goes looking for a man with true grit who will help her track down Cheney. And she finds the boozy old one-eyed Rooster Conklin, who goes along with her to track down Cheney. They also come across a very entertaining character, a Texas Ranger named LaBeef, which in the most recent movie version is played again by Matt Damon, and it's one of my favorite Matt Damon characters. He's like the nerdiest, dorkiest, cool guy in the world. It's a great character. But this is a great book. Like a lot of real Westerns, it is rough. It's violent. Life in the Old West wasn't fun a lot of times, and that comes through in True Grit. So again, two very entertaining revenge tales. And this will be interesting if you read these back to back. It's not going to feel like they were published a century apart, or not a century apart. Yeah, a century apart, 120 something years. They're going to feel much more like contemporaries because of how ahead of the game of Count of Monte Cristo was. So you're really going to enjoy both of those. I know I did. All right, our last public domain title for the day is Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. Now, this was, talk about a book that was ahead of its time. So Don Quixote was published in 1605, over 400 years ago. And at that time, novels weren't really popular. Excuse me. And Don Quixote is often credited with being the first real popular novel. One way that De Cervantes is really ahead of his time is he builds this sort of meta-fictional framework where in the beginning of the story, he claims that he found, the first couple of chapters in the archives of La Mancha, and then the rest are translated from an Arabic text by a Moorish author. Of course, that was all false. Miguel de Cervantes wrote it all, but he framed it in such a way that it was more palatable for audiences of his time. But now we look at it, and this is way ahead of its time. The way he's framing the narrative like that. This is stuff that is really, really high quality fiction writing at a time when fiction wasn't even being written really. So it's really entertaining. The story here is about an old man who has spent too much time staying up late reading fiction, and because he was not lying down at night, his brain has dried out. Interesting look at 17th century medicine there. So his brain has dried out, and he can no longer tell the difference between fiction and real life. So he begins acting out the chivalric tales of knights in the books that he likes to read. He thinks he's going on an adventure, thinks he's running into kings and queens and princes when it's actually just peasants and prostitutes in rural Spain. Really interesting. It gets even more meta in the part two. In part two, which was published 10 years after the original, the characters are aware of the first book, and they're grappling with being characters in a book. It's so ahead of its time. I mean, again, we're 400 years ago, and he's really, what is reality, messing with readers' heads. It's really great. And it reminds me of my favorite science fiction author of all time, and our second title, We Can Remember It For You, Wholesale by Philip K. Dick. Now, you might know this book better as Total Recall. It was made in several movies with that title. The story here is that a somewhat disillusioned middle manager decides to spice up his life. So he goes to a company that implants memories. So the idea here is that if you can't afford to go on an actual vacation, they implant the memory of a vacation in your head. And then you even go home with a couple of souvenirs, and it's like it actually happened. So of course the main character goes in to get a memory implanted. They discover that other memories have already been wiped and covered, and other things have been implanted in there, and it turns into a spy novel, and it's really great. But what really sticks with you in We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, like a lot of Philip K. Dick books, is that it deals with just the nature of reality. Philip K. Dick posits that maybe all we are collections of memories that then inform our behavior. We react to things now based on our memories of how things have gone in the past, our reactions with things. So if we're able to implant memories, then we're able to manipulate behavior. And if we've changed someone's memory and their behavior, we've changed them as a whole human being. And if we don't know, if you have these implanted memories that are indistinguishable from real memories that are changing your personality, is that any different than an actual event having gone on? So it really gets your head spinning, like a lot of Philip K. Dick books do. He is my absolute favorite author. I could talk about him all day, but I'm not. I'm not going to bring up his belief that we lived in the time of Christ, and that modern reality was just a veil sent by the devil to trick us. I'm not going to talk about the Android version of Philip K. Dick that was built and then lost and has never been found, which is a true story. But I'm not going to talk about that because I can talk about Philip K. Dick forever. So I'm just going to highly recommend we can remember it for you, Wholesale. And then if you want something 400 years older, that's going to tickle a lot of the same parts of your brain. I highly recommend Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. All right, folks, that's all I have for you today. Thanks so much for watching, and definitely stay on the lookout for more episodes of Quarantine Theater. All right, folks, stay safe out there, be kind to one another, and have a great day. Okay, see ya. Bye.